Right, again, welcome to the class, Talmudic topics. Every week the topic changes. I wish I could find a curriculum that maybe help it have like a string where even though it's separate classes, but they all kind of build a bigger picture, and then move on to the next topic. But for now, I found something from this week's Parsha actually. If anyone here got the email from Myra this morning, I put in their source sheets. So you can have the source sheets. Murray, I'm not sure if you have them or not. If you need them, let me know, and I can try to that you can. If you get the Shul's emails, it's in the email there.
Yeah, I got it.
Amazing. Okay, great. So, what we're going to talk about today, the topic is there's a mitzvah in the Torah that when it comes to a Jewish slave, which we'll talk about that in a second. But a Jewish slave, when he's finishes his slavery, meaning his term, there's no such thing as a Jewish slave that's a slave forever. Then the owner has to give him like a parting gift, like to acknowledge all the work he did for him, etc., as he leaves. So that's the topic for today. I want to read it in the Torah, and then we'll talk. I'll explain a little more, and then we'll jump into what we're going to discuss. So if you see the first, it's from this week's parsha. Right after it talks about the mitzvah of tzedakah, actually, then it talks about this mitzvah. So that's why I included the last verse from the previous discussion in the Torah about tzedakah, Deuteronomy 15, chapter 15, verse 11. I'll just read the English. It says, for there will never cease to be needy ones in your land. Meaning, unfortunately, there will always be poor people around, which is why I command you, open your hand to the poor and the needy kin in your land. Okay, so it's a few of the verses before where we're also talking about tzedakah, but that's what it's talking about. And then it moves on to a new mitzvah. It says on 15:12, if a fellow Hebrew man or woman is sold to you, specifically a Jewish slave, he shall serve you for 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall set him free. The maximum, so to speak, servitude from a Jewish slave is 6 years. In the 7th year, you have to set him free. Now, 15:13, when you set him free, do not let him go empty-handed. You can't just send him empty-handed. Now he has to go figure everything out. Rather, 15:14, furnish him out of the flock, threshing floor and vat with which your God Hashem has blessed you. So you have to give him, it says, from flock, meaning you have to give him some animals, threshing floor, which is grain, you have to give him some grain, and vat, which is wine. You have to give him these amounts of you have to give him a certain amount of these things. So I'm just trying to let someone in the waiting room. It's in the waiting room. How to do this actually. That's there's a certain amount you have to give. The Talmud discusses that, but that's the general. That's the mitzvah. The mitzvah is that when a slave is finally going home to his own house, you have to give him some sort of footing to have as he's going to embark on his freedom. That is the mitzvah. The mitzvah is called hanaka in Hebrew, which they're translating here as furnish. But that is what the mitzvah is about. Now, I want to jump in. So first, I want to preface that. Okay, we're talking about only a Jewish slave. Non-Jewish slaves have different set of rules, which we'll talk about maybe another time. But we're talking about a Jewish slave specifically. Now, before we jump in, I need to let you know there's 2 times a Jewish person can become a slave. There's only 2 times. It's either he sells himself, he finds himself to not have, he doesn't have enough money, he can't support himself, whatever the reason exactly is. But it's like the Torah says, you can't sell yourself as a slave unless you literally have nothing left, like even like the shirt on your back. Like you have nothing, then the Torah allows a person to sell himself as a slave. So the master will give him food but he'll do work, etc. Like the arrangement is. That's one way. That's called Meicher Atzma. He sells himself. Another category is Machru Bezdin, is where the court will sell a Jewish person as a slave. Now, why would a court feel the need to sell a Jewish person as a slave. So it's a unique case where someone stole from another Jew, and he was convicted of this stealing that he committed, and he didn't have enough money to pay back what he was supposed to. So because he doesn't have enough money, but he stole and he owes money, so the court has an obligation to sell him as a slave, and from the money that the court receives from the master that buys him, that the person that was stolen from will get paid back, will get his money back that was stolen. So he's paid back through the sale of this robber, of this person that stole from him. That is the only two cases. Again, either he sells himself because he has no money, or the court sold him in a case where he stole and he had no money to pay back, so the court sells him as a slave. Those are the two cases. One's called Mecher Atzma, he sells himself. One's called Mechur Bezdin, that the court sells him. Now, let's read through the specific thing that we're going to read about today. So the first book we're going to read after we read from the Torah, from this week's parsha, is called the Sefer HaChinuch. You have it here, and it's still on the first page. Sefer HaChinuch, Mitzvah 482:4. So what exactly is the Chinuch? I just want to give a background, a short background, brief background. What exactly is the Sefer HaChinuch? So the word Chinuch we know means education. That's Chinuch. What is this book exactly? So the author, I forgot his name, I'll have to look it up. He wrote this book as a guide to his son. His son, unfortunately, was straying from the Torah path, was getting caught up. And he, in order to help his son, he wrote a whole book going through all 613 mitzvahs, giving them a little explanation, a little bit about the laws, telling you a little what's behind the mitzvahs. And he wrote an entire book like this, and it's called the Sefer HaChinuch, the book of education, because he was like trying to educate his child that was going off the Torah path. So that's just a brief background on what this book is. So it's Mitzvah 482, and this is like section, paragraph 4. So here we go. He said, I'm just going to read the English, but you had the Hebrew there if you want to take a look at it. He writes like this: and this commandment is practiced by males and females at the time of the temple, as the law of a Hebrew slave is only practiced at the time that the Jubilee is practiced, as I have written in what preceded. So this is a separate idea that there's a lot of mitzvahs are dependent on the fact that the Jewish nation was functioning as the Torah nation that God set out. Meaning, the main factor was the Yovel. We know that there's every 7 years is a Shemitah year. Then, which is this year is actually a Shemitah year. At the end of 7 cycles of Shemitah years, which is 7 times 7, 49 years, the 50th year is a Jubilee year. And just like in Shemitah, you're not allowed to work the land. So in Jubilee year also they can't work the land. So it's 2 consecutive years of leaving the land fallow. Now, so this Jubilee year, this whole idea of keeping the Jubilee year only applies when all the Jews, or almost all the Jews, live in the land of Israel. That is the law. So as long as most Jews aren't living there, the whole idea of Jubilee, of Yovel, doesn't apply. And if Yovel doesn't apply, if Jubilee year doesn't apply, then a lot of other specific laws don't apply either. That's why you might have heard Truma, Chala. Some of these things might not be on the Torah level. It might be the rabbis said to do it as a remembrance, etc. But a lot of these mitzvahs are actually not on the Torah obligation level because we don't have the Jubilee year. We're not functioning as the Jewish nation in Israel the way it's set out. We're not saying it's a bad thing. It's just a technicality. You know, where most Jews aren't living there, so the whole concept of Yovel, Jubilee, doesn't exist, and therefore a lot of other mitzvahs that are dependent on that also do not apply, do not exist. That is the first part what he mentioned. So this whole concept of a Jewish slave in general, doesn't exist anymore. No Jew nowadays is allowed to sell himself as a slave, or can. It wouldn't be a purchase that has significance, and no Jew, no courts can sell a Jew today, because again, like we said, when there's no jubilee, there's no concept of Jewish slaves. Now, so how would we apply this whole idea of this parting gift to a slave nowadays? So he says like this, and nonetheless, even at this time, where again there's no jubilee, there's no concept of a Jewish slave, the wise man listens and adds insight. Yeah, he's quoting a verse. A wise man listens and adds insight, even if it's not practical to his specific situation. He finds a way to adapt it, such that if he employed someone from the children of Israel, he employed a Jewish person, not as a slave, he hired him as a worker, and he's employed him, and he served him for a long time, or even a short time, he should endow him with that which God blessed him when he leaves him. So, in other words, what he's saying is, even though, again, the mitzvah itself doesn't apply, but the concept of the mitzvah we can definitely apply by saying that nowadays we don't have slaves, but we have workers. And when a worker finishes, a Jewish worker finishes, we should feel the obligation to have a parting gift for him as an acknowledgement for the work he did. This is in addition to the payment that was agreed upon. Besides the payment that was agreed upon, the chinuch, the Sefer HaChinuch is saying that we should feel an obligation to give a endowment, a gift of acknowledgement for the work that the person did. And he says this is even whether he served him for a long time or even if he served him for a short time, he should give him such a gift. Okay, very nice. So again, the mitzvah of Jewish slavery doesn't apply nowadays, but he finds a way to still apply this mitzvah of a parting gift by saying that we have workers, which aren't slaves, but they still work for us, and we should acknowledge that, and therefore give them some sort of parting gift, some sort of endowment when they finish their work. Okay, this is what the Sefer HaChinuch writes. Now, we're going to read the Talmud, the Gemara, and we're going to see something that's a question on what we just read. So here we go. The Talmud doesn't, the Mishnah can say a certain law, and the Talmud always wants to know, where did this law come from? Where did you get it from? It doesn't say it, if it's something that's clearly written in the Torah, maybe the Gemara won't ask that. But if it's something that's not so clear, the Gemara will ask, where did you derive this law about endowment, etc.? So here, this is the Gemara writes. The Mishnah teaches that a Hebrew slave can be acquired through money. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive this halacha? That you can buy a slave through money. In general, every purchase, every sale always has a Torah certified, so to speak, method, how the purchase is done. You can't just decide like this or like that. There's certain methods that need to be done to make it a purchase or a transaction official. So how do you buy a slave? How is a slave bought? So it's one of the ways is with money. By the buyer handing the money. When the buyer hands the money to the seller, the slave was transitioned and transferred to the ownership of the buyer. The Gemara is asking, where do we know this from? How do we know that you can do this acquisition through money, through the handing over of the money? So the Gemara answers, the verse states, out of the money for that he was bought for. It's whatever the context of the verse is, but it says he was bought with money. So you see that how is the buying, the purchasing done? It's through money, which is that he can be acquired through money. Gemara further asks, we found the source in this verse for a slave who was sold by the court. This verse is referring to a thief who is unable to repay the value of his theft and is sold as a slave so he can repay his debt, which I mentioned before. So this verse that we quoted, that a slave is bought through money, that was only referring to the category of a slave that's sold by the court, that stole and then was consequently sold by the court. But one can therefore argue that this case is unique since he is sold against his will, and therefore the acquisition happens through money. From where do we derive that one who sells himself can be sold through money? Remember, there's two categories. So the first category we see clearly in the verse says that the transaction happens through money. But someone that sells himself, how do we know that happens through money? It's a different category of a slave. So the Gemara answers that one derives this through a verbal analogy between the terms hired worker and hired worker. And here in the commentary, they write the two verses. They both use this word sachir, and therefore this is a concept called gzera shava. I don't want to get into that length, but I'll just let you know there's a certain method of learning out from the Torah. It's called gzera shava, where you take a verse in one verse, a word from a verse in one place, and another place has a very similar word or the same word. And if you can learn out laws from one verse to another, kind of through this trapdoor, so to speak, through this, if it has a similar word. Now, I just want to clarify: you can't take any word and just start. It says a similar word somewhere else. It only works with words that were known as part of the tradition that were open for such learning, to transfer a law from one place to another. You can't just choose any word and say, "Oh, there's another verse that has a similar word." Rather, it's something that was passed down. Which words were available for this method, for this learning? It didn't necessarily say what is learned out from each word, but it was part of the tradition that this word is available. So the Gemara is answering that because they both types of slaves have this word sacher, so whatever law is said by one slave, we can transfer and learn for the other one. And if therefore one of them is purchased through money, the transaction happens through money. So too, the other one also, the transaction happens through money. Okay. So you think that's very simple, very nice. But no, the Gemara, I'm skipping the commentary. I'm still in 14b. The Gemara asks, this works out well according to the one who derives this verbal analogy between the terms hired worker and hired worker. Meaning there are two opinions. Not everyone learns out this gzera shava, this learning out one word from the other. But according to the one who does not derive the verbal analogy between hired worker and hired worker, what can be said? From where does he derive that one who sells himself may be purchased through money? According to him, he doesn't learn this whole trapdoor method, so to speak, where he learns out one slave from another type of slave. So how do we know, according to that opinion, that you can purchase through money? Now the Gemara finds a source. That's not for now. But the Gemara wants to know, who are these two opinions? One opinion learns out from a hired worker, this gzera shava, this trapdoor method, and the other opinion doesn't. Where did the Gemara get that there are two opinions? So that's what the Gemara asks here. Next part, the Gemara comments, and who is the Tana who does not derive the verbal analogy between hired worker and hired worker? So the Gemara says, it is this Tana. It's taught in a Breita. Breita is very similar to the Mishnah. It just didn't make it to the final cut, so to speak. But it's the same people that are talking in the Mishnah are talking in the Breita. It says like this: one who sells himself as a slave is sold for 6 years, and if he wishes, he can be sold for more than 6 years. Whereas one who's sold by the court is only sold for 6 years, but no more. So what this Breita is doing, it's going through a lot of laws that have to do with a Jewish slave, and it's comparing them and saying, oh, again, we have two categories of Jewish slaves. One that is sold by the court, one that sells himself, and we want to know if all the laws that apply to one apply to the other or not. So that's what this Breita is doing. It's comparing the two categories of Jewish slaves. Now I'll just say it outside, just because it's a little easier than reading each one inside. There's one part of the law is that we said a Jewish slave can't be sold for more than 6 years. So he's saying, this rabbi who's talking is saying that it's only referring to a Jewish slave that was sold by the court. But if someone sells himself, he could make that decision to be sold for more than 6 years. It's not limited to 6 years. That's one difference. Another difference he lists is the concept of pegging the ear. I don't know if you might have read it in the Torah before. If a slave, after the 6 years, says, I know I'm supposed to be free, but I don't want to be freed. I like this situation. He adapted the slave mentality. Everything's taken care of. Says he was given a maid servant as a wife. He had children with her. Like he likes his master. He likes the setup. So he doesn't want to leave. So what's the law then? Because officially the slavery is over, but he wants to stay. So there's a special law that he could stay until Jubilee year. And part of the process is they kind of pierce through his ear. And Rashi explains it's to tell him, look, you were by Mount Sinai, and God said the Jewish people are my slaves. Yeah, which in other words is my slaves are not slaves to other people. And this person went ahead and is consciously deciding to be a slave and not a slave, and not being a slave to God. Not that so we say because that ear, so to speak, that was Bauman Sinai and didn't pay attention to this concept, or he heard it but it didn't take it to heart, that we're God's slaves and not slaves to anyone else. So we kind of pierce his ear to like remind him about his improper choice. And then he's a slave till Jubilee. Again, this is someone that decided to extend his slavery. The next law is the law about, like I mentioned, a slave could be given a maidservant as a wife while he's in slavery. Now, this maidservant is not a Jewish maidservant. She's a non-Jewish slave. He could still be together with her as long as he's a slave. But once he leaves his slavery, like I mentioned, he won't be able to be married to her anymore because she's not Jewish. So this concept that the slave can marry a non-Jewish maidservant, it only applies, he says, only applies to someone that's sold by the court, but not someone that sells himself. And the other last law, which is the one that's consequential for our discussion, is this endowment that we mentioned, the one that we started off with. There's a gift for the slave that leaves slavery as he leaves. So that law, that obligation to give the slave a gift as he leaves, only applies to someone that was sold by the court. But if someone sells himself, this whole law does not apply to him. This is what the first sage says. Now we call a sage, this sage doesn't have a name in the Breita, it doesn't say a name, it just quotes it without any name. So we call that, in Talmud language, we call that a Tana Kama. Kama means first. Tana is the term for the sages of the Mishnah. So he's the first Tana. He's like the first sage of his Breita. We don't have a name for him. So that was that paragraph. I'm already moving on to the next. So the next one starts with Rabbi Lezer says that there's no difference between these two types of slaves. Rabbi Lezer says there's no difference. All the four laws that we mentioned about a Jewish slave apply to both types of slave, both categories, whether he was sold by the court, whether he sells himself, all four of these laws apply. In other words, for our discussion, even if someone sells himself, when he's done, whenever his slave term is finished, the owner, the master, has to give him a gift. Not only the one that was sold by the court, but even the one that sells himself. The law of giving a gift to him as he leaves applies. So that's the argument in this Breita. Now, why did we bring this Breita? To say, look, if you hold that they're so different, there's these four laws that the two categories are so different, it means you don't use this trapdoor method. You don't learn out one from another. If you learned out one from another, from the word hired worker to hired worker, then you would have to apply all the laws that apply to one apply to the other. And the fact that the Tana Kama, the first sage, said that they're so different, there are four laws there's four different laws about them that they're different. That obviously means he doesn't learn out from this method. He doesn't learn out one from another. And the one that said they are the same is because he does learn out from this method. That is what the Gemara is proposing. Again, the Gemara wanted to know who uses this trapdoor method, this Gzera Shava, and we found out, it depends. If you hold that all the laws of a slave sold by court apply to a slave that sells himself. Okay. Now, the Gemara, we have two more short pieces about this. The Gemara brings a person named Rav Tivyemi, and he said this in the name of Abaya. That really I have a different option to understand this argument. I can say that really they both hold of this trapdoor, this learning one category from the other category, and they really should be the same. Why did the first sage say that they're different than these 4 laws? Because each one of these 4 laws has a verse or a word in the Torah that tells you specifically this law doesn't apply to someone that sells himself. And the Gemara goes through each one. We're not going to do that, but the Gemara goes through each one and says, oh, you see, it says this word. So therefore, that law doesn't apply. Really, all laws apply, besides for this one. You know what? And the next law also has the same thing. A specific word tells us that the law doesn't apply, until it ends up being that all 4 of these laws don't apply to someone that sells himself. But not because we don't learn out one from another. Really, we do learn out one slave from another slave, one category from the other category. It's just that there's these 4 laws were excluded. That's his way of learning the arguments between the first sage and Rebbe Lazar. Now the last part of the Kiddushin 15a, that's the last part of the Talmud we're going to read. See, Kiddushin 15a, it says, the Gemara clarifies additional details with regard to this dispute. What is the reasoning of the first Tana, who says one does not grant a severance gift to one who sells himself? Why does he say that? So with regard to one who's sold by the court, the merciful one excludes, meaning the Torah writes in a certain case by the verse, it says like this: you shall give a severance gift to him. It says you have to give a severance gift to him. Who's him? To him means to the one who's sold by the court, because that's what the verse is talking about there, but not to one who sells himself. That's what it's trying to point out. Him, he gets a severance gift. Specifically the one that's sold by the court, because that's what the verse is referring to. But if it's not him, meaning the other category of slaves, someone that sells himself, then this law of the severance gift does not apply. That's where he learns it out from. Okay. So in short, there's 2 categories. Again, just to recap, there's 2 categories of slaves. The one that has all these special laws about only being sold for 6 years, about marrying a non-Jewish slave woman, about getting pierced in the ear and serving till Jubilee, and giving the severance gift, those all are only written by a slave that's sold by the court. And there's an argument if that applies also to a slave that sells himself. The first sage holds that it doesn't apply to him. The second sage holds that it does apply to him. Okay. Rabbi Lazar is the one that holds it does apply to him. Now let's look for the actual law. Let's look for the law itself. So we have the Rambam, Mishnah Torah, Slaves, Chapter 3, Halacha 12. I cut it short to make it easier. That's why you see those 3 dots, because I skipped the other 3 laws. I only went to the one that's relevant here. What are the differences between a servant who sells himself and a servant sold by the court? It says a servant who sells himself does not receive a severance gift, while a servant sold by the court does receive a severance gift. So you see that halacha, the law, the final law, the Rambam saying that someone that's sold by the court, he is the one that gets a severance gift. But someone that is sells himself does not get it. Which in other words, the Rambam is going according to the first sage in the Braita, the one that said that there are differences between the 2 categories, and therefore it doesn't apply to the one that the slave that sells himself. Okay, this is all introduction. It took a little longer than I planned. So now let's think back for a second. We started off by reading the Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch said that even though the whole idea of a Jewish slave doesn't apply nowadays because there's no Jubilee year, still we can learn out from it. But how? By when you hire a worker for whatever amount of time, you should be giving him some sort of severance gift, or whatever, some sort of acknowledgement in addition to the agreed upon money that you're going to give him. You should give him something else also as acknowledgement for what he did. That is what the Chinuch said, and that we read in the beginning. But there's a big question. Seemingly, what is the law? What does the Rambam write? That if someone sells himself, he doesn't get the severance gift. Now, if this is something very simple I'm about to say. Someone that's a worker, which that's how we applied it nowadays. Which category of Jewish slave is he more similar to? Is he similar to someone that's sold by the court or someone that sells himself? Obviously, a worker who is in full control of who he works for, he signs the contract on his own. He has choice. So it's the same thing, pretty much the same thing as a slave that sells himself. Not someone that's sold by the court. Someone that's sold by the court, the whole idea is he was forced to be sold. It wasn't his choice. But a worker, it's very much his choice to work for whoever he works for nowadays. So if a worker is similar to a slave that sells himself, then this whole law should not apply to him. This whole idea of a severance gift, this whole idea of acknowledging his work when he's done should not apply nowadays, because it's a special law for someone that's sold by the court. So if you sell yourself or if you hire yourself out, this whole idea should not apply. That is the question that's asked on the chinuch. It's interesting. The Sefer Chinuch that we opened up with, he actually has a book, a person dedicated a whole book to comment on his book. So his book is called a Sefer Chinuch, and there's someone that comments on his book, on the glosses on both sides. He's called the Minchas Chinuch. That's what he called himself. And he asked this question. He says, it's known that the chinuch always follows the Rambam, Maimonides, unless he says otherwise. But if he doesn't say otherwise, you assume he's going according to Maimonides. And Maimonides, the Rambam said clearly that a person that sells himself as a slave does not get a severance gift. So how could the chinuch write that a person that when you hire a worker, you should have to give him a severance gift? He hired himself out. It was his choice. So how does it apply? This was all a build up to the question we're going to tackle. There's a lot of introduction. So let's see what we can do in the short time we have left. So I'll give the short version. Remember the reason. What was the reason why a slave that sells himself doesn't get the severance gift? So we gave two options. I'm going to stick to the second one for now. We gave two. The second way we knew this law was because it says, like we read inside in Kedushin 15a, the last part of the Talmud that we had, it said, it's written in the Torah, you shall give him, you should give a severance gift to him. What does to him mean? To him, to someone that's sold by the court, and not someone that is sold as a slave. So there's two ways to understand this. Is it that really every slave should be getting a severance gift? It's just that the Torah said in this unique case you don't give him. Or do we say that this whole idea of severance gift is a novelty? It's something that I wouldn't think of that on my own. Torah obligates it in a specific case. So if that's the way we look at it, then it only applies to wherever the Torah obligates it, because it's something that's not really you come up with on your own. It's a novel idea, so it only applies to the case that the Torah says it applies to. But you can't extend it to other places because this whole idea is a novel idea. So that's the two ways of looking at it. Do we look at it that it's something that really should apply to all cases? It's just over here it's excluded, or do we say it should really apply, or it really only applies to wherever the Torah says, and that's it, because it's a new novel idea we don't really know about. Now, to give this maybe a little better terms, to maybe help it be understood a little better, how do we look at this severance gift? Do we look at it as a payment? It's almost basically part of the payment. Now, you agreed upon a certain number, but in addition to that, the Torah says you have to pay him more than that. You have to give him a severance gift, but it's all part of his payment. It's basically something that he earned, and you have to give that to him. Or do we look at it as more of like an act of charity? You're the owner, you're the hirer, you're the one that has more money. This person's working for you, probably working hard for you. So you, as like an act of tzedakah, you should give him something as part of his severance gift. Again, so that's the two ways of looking at it. Is it like a form of, it's like payment, just an additional payment the Torah obligates you, or is it more like tzedakah? Now, which one of these two options are more logical, or in other words, are less novel? So if you think about it, for me, for a second, I thought I got an opposite, but I'll get straight to it. If you say that it's tzedakah, so then you know what? We heard of the idea of tzedakah before. We know the Torah obligates us to give us tzedakah. It's not something new to us. So you know what? That maybe would make sense to give to any slave, any person. You know, they don't have a lot of money. That's why they were slaves. So give them a little extra as tzedakah. That's not so novel, this idea. But if you say that you have to give a severance gift because as a form of payment, in addition to what you agreed upon, whoa, why do I have to pay this? Why is this part of the payment? That's already more of a novel idea. Why do I have to give the severance gift as payment? What payment for what? We agreed upon last. It's something novel, something that doesn't really click. So right away, at least. So therefore, if you learn it like that, it would only apply to the case that the Torah says, but not to any other case. But if you say it's tzedakah again, then it's something that should apply to all cases. Now, why is it relevant, the two ways of looking at it? Because that really leads to the argument. If it applies to that really leads to this point that we're getting to. If you say that it's tzedakah, and again, which means it should really apply in all cases, but the Torah said it doesn't apply to a specific case, to someone that sells himself. Yeah, like we read in the Talmud. So then, you know what? I'm going to say that, fine, maybe that's one case that the Torah says not to give him a severance gift, but all other cases you should. And to make this understandable, like I mentioned before, there's a concept that the Torah is upset if someone sells himself as a slave or wants to be a slave. Because, like we said, God said the Jewish people are my slaves. They shouldn't be going around becoming slaves to other people. So someone that sold himself willingly, the Torah, let's just say, isn't so fond. The Torah acknowledges that he's desperate, so the Torah lets it happen. But the Torah is not so fond of someone that sells himself into slavery. And therefore the Torah says, such a person, even though I said this idea of tzedakah, this idea of a severance gift, he doesn't get it because he sold himself willingly. So he doesn't get it. Yeah, you give a severance to him, to the slave that's sold by the court, not willingly. But someone that sells himself willingly, he doesn't get a severance gift. That if we look at it like that, so then what about a hired worker? A worker like nowadays. A worker is not a slave. He's not a slave. Yes, he consciously hires himself out, but he's not a slave. He didn't go against this idea of God saying, oh, you're my slaves, don't become slaves to other people. It's totally fine to hire yourself out as a worker. That's totally fine. And therefore, the severance gift should go to him. Even though, remember we asked earlier, who's a hired worker more similar to? A slave that sells himself or a slave that's sold by the court? So we assumed he's more similar to a slave that sells himself, because just like a slave sold himself, he hires himself out willingly. But now we're pointing out a big difference between a slave and a worker. A slave is something that the Torah is not fond of, but a worker is totally fine. So therefore, since this whole idea, we look at this whole mitzvah of severance, the severance gift, as a form of tzedakah, which should apply to everyone. If the Torah says it doesn't apply to this case, you know, fine. It doesn't apply to that case, but all the cases should still apply. And therefore, we can understand the chinuch. The chinuch writes that nowadays, even though the whole idea of slavery doesn't apply, but we should still take this idea of a severance gift and give it to someone that works for you. We asked, what do you mean? You don't give a severance gift to a slave that sells himself. So we're explaining that this severance gift, the fact that a slave that sells himself doesn't get a severance gift, really he should get. Torah writes that he specifically shouldn't. He doesn't get this form of tzedakah. And why? We're explaining because he sells himself as a slave, which the Torah is not fond of. But this hired worker who didn't sell himself as a slave, he's not a slave. Maybe he hired himself out willingly, but he's not a slave. So then he should get that severance gift just like anyone else. And therefore, it is very appropriate nowadays to give a worker a severance gift. Now, it's not the mitzvah itself. The mitzvah itself is talking about slavery, but he's like he said, how did he word it in English? He quoted a verse. The Chinuch wrote, a wise man listens and adds insight. Yeah, the Torah said to give a severance gift to a slave, but the Chinuch says we should apply it to workers also. And based on the way we're understanding that the severance gift is tzedakah, it's not a form of payment. If it's a form of payment, then we don't understand why you should have to pay this, and therefore we don't apply it to anywhere else besides for where the Torah says we should apply it to. But since the Rambam, Maimonides, learns that it's a form of tzedakah, therefore, it really should, and that makes sense. It's not something he earned, but I should give it to him. He does, he doesn't need it. So therefore, it should apply to all cases. And only where the Torah says it doesn't apply, fine, it doesn't apply there. But all other cases, including a hired worker, since he's not a slave, he didn't sell himself as a slave, we have no issue with him. And that should be totally acceptable to have to give him this tzedakah. Now, just to prove this point, that it's tzedakah, if you look, the Rambam, besides for his book of laws, he also wrote another book called Sefer HaMitzvos, the book of mitzvos. Very similar concept to the Chinuch that we mentioned earlier. He wrote a book to his son of all the mitzvahs. The Rambam also wrote a book of mitzvahs, counting the 613 mitzvahs. Now over there, if you look, where does he have this mitzvah of the severance gift to the slave? He doesn't put it in the laws of slaves. He put in the area where he talks about slaves. Rather, he puts it right next to the mitzvah of tzedakah. So you see that the Rambam looks at this law of severance gift not as a form of payment, as part of his slavery. Rather, it's really just tzedakah that you're giving him, and therefore, like we said, it should apply to all of them. And that's why, really, in the Torah itself, where did the Rambam get this idea? Because in the Torah itself, like I showed you, like I started off with, if you look, the verse right before talking about the severance gift, it talks about tzedakah. So you see in the Torah itself, it was trying to tell you that this whole idea of the severance gift is really a form of tzedakah, and therefore it should apply to all cases, because anyone that needs tzedakah, you should have to give it to him. And it's just that a slave that sells himself, that's an exclusion. The Torah is not fond of him because he sold himself as a slave, so he doesn't get it, but everyone else should get it. And that is how we can understand why the Chinuch writes that nowadays you should have an obligation in a tzedakah way, but you should have an obligation to give a worker that works for you some sort of severance gift before, as he leaves. And that's something that's obviously very applicable and, relevant today, that when we have a worker that works for us, give him a gift. I don't know what exactly would constitute as a gift. It could be, you give a cold can of Coke. I don't know what exactly, it has to be. But it's something that wasn't agreed upon, but it's acknowledging the work that he's doing for you. The fact that he's doing work for you, that you don't have to do yourself. So that is the concept. So the what changed, what was like the specific part that really changed in perspective is, again, that how do we look at a hired worker today? Is he similar to a slave that sells himself or not? So first we said, yeah, it's very similar to a slave that sells himself. Then we made a big distinction. One's a slave and one's not. And the Torah is not fond of people willingly making themselves slaves. And that's why he doesn't get it, but everyone else should get it. That was the big, the big switchover. You always, like, whenever you learn something, you have a question and an answer, you always want to pinpoint. What was wrong in the way I was looking at it before, and that's that I had the question, and what changes in the answer. So that's always the way to really, as we say in Yiddish, chap. Really chap what happened is by pinpointing, where that change was made. So even though I asked a question, I answered it not in these words, but the real change was the perspective on a hired worker. He's not really like a slave that sells himself. Rather, he's just someone that needs money, and that's why he's giving himself out to work. But he's not a slave. That's the big difference. So you have the obligation to give him tzedakah. That is today's topic. There was more could have said, but I think we have a complete picture here. Anyone have any questions? I'll take that as a compliment.
Oh, it's all good. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you for joining. And, happy to see everyone. And looking forward to next time. Remember, as I always do on Mondays, there's a Tani class tonight. There's a Tani class tonight at 7 p.m. at the synagogue, but there's an option also to be on Zoom. And if you got the shul email, I asked Myra to put a link to the actual Tanya that we're going to be reading, so you can read it before I know what's going to be discussed. It's definitely going to be a lot more enjoyable that way.
Oh, good.
So yeah,
Thank you.
Looking forward to seeing everyone again, and have a
Forward
great,
to seeing you.
amazing rest of your Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.